Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a set of ideas that essentially functions as a sort of universal solvent. If you pour it over politics, finance, journalism, or even your own career, it just kind of dissolves the nonsense to reveal the actual structural machinery underneath. We are talking about skin in the game.
Yeah, and it's a phrase that is really permeated the culture, right?
Yeah.
But I think most people use it incorrectly. They think it just means um, having a financial stake in an outcome. Like, I bought shares, so I have skin in the game. But the source material we're dissecting today argues that it's much more than that. It is a literal filter for reality. It's a mechanism for ethics, for competence, and ultimately it's the only reason civilization hasn't totally collapsed yet.
Right. And the central thesis here is actually quite disturbing when you sit with it. The source argues that the modern world is defined by this malignant transfer of fragility. We've constructed a society where a very specific class of people, bankers, bureaucrats, pundits, they've figured out how to keep all the upside of their decisions while transferring the downside, the pain, the risk to everyone else.
That is the core asymmetry. I mean, in a healthy system, if you make a decision, you own the consequences. If you build a bridge and it falls down, you are responsible. But we've evolved away from that. We've created this wedge between the ethical and the legal. We have systems now where you can crash the global economy or start a disastrous war, and not only do you not pay a penalty, but you might actually get a bonus or a promotion.
Which is the agency problem writ large. And I want to start there because usually when economists talk about the agency problem, they're talking about something relatively dry. Like a CEO might buy a corporate jet because it's fun for him, even though it's bad for the shareholders. It's just a misalignment of interests. But this source suggests the agency problem is actually an existential threat.
It is, because the scale has completely changed. In the past, the agency problem was local. If a blacksmith cheated you, the whole town knew and he went out of business. But today, the person acting on your behalf could be a central banker deciding interest rates for 1 billion people, or a politician drafting trade policy. If they get it wrong, they don't lose their jobs, they don't lose their pensions. But the principal, and that's you, the citizen listening to this, you might lose your savings, your business, your home.
It effectively turns the population into a giant shock absorber for the mistakes of the elite.
That's a perfect way to put it, a shock absorber. And Source contrasts this with the concept of heroism in historical societies. We tend to view history as this long series of oppressions where the powerful just extracted value from the weak. And while that obviously happened, the source argues that stable societies, the ones that actually lasted, were built on the exact opposite premise. The leaders took more downside risk than the commoner.
This is the captain goes down with the ship mental model, right?
Precisely. In the ancient world, or even in feudal structures, privilege came with a very heavy price tag. If you were a Roman emperor, your life expectancy was statistically lower than your average foot soldier.
Really? I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, assassination, dying in battle, poison, it was a high-risk job. If you were a medieval lord, you didn't sit in a bunker safely away from the front lines. You literally led the charge. If the war was lost, you were the very first person to be executed by the enemy.
Even in the mafia, which the source references surprisingly often, the Don is the most targeted individual.
Right, the mafia is a fascinating case study here because it's an illegal economy, so they can't rely on contract law or courts. They have to rely purely on skin in the game. A Don who takes the upside without taking the risk of being whacked doesn't remain a Don for long. The source argues that modern bureaucracy has totally inverted this.
Yeah.
We now have a class of people who have the status of kings, but the risk profile of, well, ghosts. They're untouchable.
So let's visualize this because the source creates a taxonomy of the world, dividing humanity into 3 distinct columns based on their relationship with risk. This is referred to as Table 7 in the text. I think walking through this is really crucial because it helps you, the listener, spot these people in the wild.
It's the triad of risk, and the first column is by far the most dangerous one. No skin in the game.
The transfer class.
Yes. These are the people who keep the upside and transfer the downside to others. They possess a hidden free option. In finance terms, a free option is when you have the right to a gain without any obligation of a loss. So who fits here? Corporate executives in the managerial class, and we mean hired suits, not actual founders, bureaucrats, consultants.
I want to push on consultants for a second. The industry standard defense is that consultants just provide advice and it's up to the client to implement it. So why does the source classify them as having no skin in the game? Isn't their reputation their skin in the game?
That is the standard defense. You hear it all the time. If I give that advice, I won't get hired again. But the source argues that in large, complex systems, that feedback loop is completely broken. A management consultant can recommend a massive restructuring plan that boosts the stock price for 2 quarters, which triggers their success fee, by the way.
Hmm.
But it secretly hollows out the company's R&D, leading to a total collapse 5 years later.
And by the time the collapse happens,
The consultant is long gone. The CEO who hired them has already moved on to another company, and the blame is just diffuse. There is no direct penalty for the delayed harm.
so the feedback loop is just too slow to act as a penalty.
Exactly. It's what the source calls complexity shielding. You hide your incompetence in the complexity of the system. Then you have the second column, which is skin in the game.
Which is the healthy middle, right?
Yeah, this is where civilization actually functions. These are people who take their own risks. If they make a mistake, they pay for it. If they succeed, they profit. This includes citizens, merchants, artisans, and true entrepreneurs.
And by true entrepreneurs, we mean people who founded the company and have their actual net worth tied up in it, not a professional CEO who parachutes in with a golden parachute.
Correct. The founder of a local bakery has skin in the game. If the bread is bad, people don't buy it and he starves. The source also includes municipal governments here, like local mayors, because they are physically proximate to the consequences. If a mayor ruins the local schools, he has to face his angry neighbors in the supermarket. He can't hide behind a security detail in Washington, D.C.
And then there's the third column. This is the one that feels almost extinct in modern discourse. Soul in the game.
This is the highest tier. Skin in the game is necessary for fairness. You pay for your own mistakes. But soul in the game is when you take the downside for the sake of others. You assume risk that you didn't even create to protect the collective.
So we're talking about saints, warriors, dissidents.
Investigative journalists. Not the talking heads on cable TV, but the ones like Anna Politkovskaya in Russia or Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, who were literally assassinated for exposing corruption. They didn't just risk their careers, they risked their lives for the truth.
The source links this explicitly to ethics. The argument is that you simply cannot separate ethics from fragility. If you are anti-fragile, meaning if you benefit from chaos or are immune to the fallout of a disaster, you cannot claim to be ethical.
Which brings up the concept of the half-person. It's such a devastating insult. A half-person is someone who has an opinion, maybe a very loud opinion about which war we should fight or which tax policy we should enact, but risks absolutely nothing if they are wrong.
It reminds me of the gladiator analogy the source uses. We look back at ancient Rome and think the barbarism was the fighting itself, the blood in the dirt.
But the source says the real barbarism was the asymmetry. The spectators in the Colosseum were perfectly safe. They were betting, they were cheering, they were feeling the thrill of the violence, but risking no blood themselves. The gladiators had soul in the game, mostly involuntarily, of course, but the spectators were half-men. The source argues that sitting in an air-conditioned office in D.C. advocating for regime change in a country you've never even visited is the modern equivalent of the Roman spectator. It's just a moral vacuum.
Which brings us perfectly to the financial system, which is arguably the most industrialized version of this half-person problem. We need to talk about the Robert Rubin trade.
This is critical for you to understand because it explains why the 2008 crisis happened and, frankly, why it will likely happen again. Robert Rubin was the Treasury Secretary under Clinton and later became a top executive at Citibank.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of the Rubin trade. How exactly does a banker transfer risk? It's not as simple as just being greedy, right? There is a structural mechanism.
It's an intertemporal transfer. It happens over time. So imagine you are a bank manager. You have a choice between a safe strategy that makes a steady 5% return every year or a highly risky strategy, like loading up on subprime mortgage bonds, that makes a 20% return for 5 years, but has a small chance of blowing up completely in year 6.
And the incentive structure obviously pushes you toward the 20%.
Heavily. Because in years 1 through 5, the bank looks like a total money printing machine. The stock soars. You, the manager, get massive performance bonuses, stock options. You cash them out. You buy the huge house in the Hamptons. You are being paid for quote-unquote performance.
And then year 6 hits. The black swan event occurs. The housing market collapses and the strategy blows up. The bank is now fundamentally insolvent.
Right. Now, in a world with real skin in the game, the banker would have to vomit up all the bonuses from the previous 5 years to cover the massive hole he just dug. But in our system, he keeps the money he already cashed out. The bank is bankrupt, but the banker is incredibly rich.
So who fills the hole?
The taxpayer does. The government steps in to save the system using public funds to recapitalize the bank. This is the ultimate transfer. The banker took the upside of the volatility and the public took the downside of the crash. Rubin himself reportedly made roughly $120 million from Citibank. When the bank required a massive public bailout, he didn't write a check for $120 million, he just kept it.
People often suggest clawbacks as the solution to this. You see this in corporate governance debates all the time now. They say, well, we'll just hold the bonus in escrow for 5 years. The source just completely dismisses this as a fallacy. Why is that?
Because it's still just deferred upside. Think about it. If I promise you a bonus in 5 years, but I don't ever touch your personal savings, the absolute worst that can happen is you get zero bonus. You don't go negative. You don't lose your house. You don't lose your freedom. True skin in the game requires the actual possibility of ruin. If the worst case scenario for a banker is just, I don't get my extra millions, they are still going to take excessive risks. They need to face the possibility of I lose everything I own.
The source gets very vivid here with historical precedents. It seems like historically we used to understand this concept a lot better.
Yeah, in Catalonia back around 1360, the regulation was extremely simple. If a banker failed, meaning he couldn't pay back depositors because he speculated wildly with their money, he was beheaded.
Beheaded, just straight up executed in front of the bank.
Literally in front of his own bank. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting we bring back capital punishment for financial crimes.
Although the source might be implicitly suggesting it, or at least the metaphorical equivalent.
The source is highlighting the stark logic of it. The threat of beheading drastically reduces your appetite for tail risk. If you know failure means death, you do not buy subprime mortgage bonds, you stick to very safe lending. And the source notes that even today, in places like Brazil, top bankers have unlimited personal liability. If the bank fails, the government seizes their personal assets, their cars, their houses, their private art collections.
Which creates a very stable, albeit much more conservative, banking sector.
Exactly. And again, Adam Smith is brought in here. Corporatists absolutely love to quote Adam Smith's invisible hand, but they completely ignore what he actually said about joint stock companies. Smith was deeply suspicious of the whole idea of professional managers. He explicitly said that managers watching over other people's money will never watch it with the same anxious vigilance as partners watching their own money.
So the literal father of capitalism effectively predicted the 2008 financial crisis.
He predicted the agency problem perfectly. He knew that separating ownership from management creates a massive breeding ground for negligence.
Let's pivot from the financial thieves to the intellectual ones, because the source seems to have an even deeper, more visceral disdain for this group, the talkers. This leads us to what is called the Stiglitz syndrome.
Right. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, a brilliant man by all traditional academic standards. But the force uses him as the absolute archetype of the fragilista.
Can you define fragilista for us?
A fragilista is someone who causes fragility in a system while genuinely thinking they are helping. They usually deal in abstract models, theories, and top-down interventions. Stiglitz syndrome is defined as a toxic combination of good intentions, extremely poor risk assessment, and crucially, ex-post cherry-picking.
The cherry picking is the part that drives me crazy when reading this. The source details the Fannie Mae incident specifically.
Yeah, this is a perfect example. Before the 2008 crash, Stiglitz and the Orszag brothers wrote a detailed report analyzing the risk of Fannie Mae, the giant mortgage entity. They concluded that the risk of default was effectively zero. They used highly sophisticated mathematical models to say the probability of failure was so astronomically low it wasn't even worth worrying about.
And then Fannie Mae collapsed entirely, costing the U.S. taxpayer billions and billions of dollars.
It was a catastrophic, generational failure of prediction. But here's the syndrome part. Years later, Stiglitz wrote a book essentially claiming he had predicted the crisis.
How does someone even get away with that? You have a literal paper trail proving you were dead wrong.
Because in the world of academia and high-level punditry, there is zero penalty for being wrong. There is no scoreboard that subtracts points from your career. You can completely contradict yourself year after year. The source calls this iatrogenics in intelligence.
Iatrogenics is a medical term, right? Meaning harm caused by the healer.
Yes. If a doctor bleeds a patient to cure a fever and the patient dies from blood loss, that's iatrogenic harm. The source argues that intellectuals like Stiglitz or Thomas Friedman engage in iatrogenics on a massive societal level. They prescribe policies like the Iraq War or hyperglobalization that cause massive global harm. But because they are credentialed experts, they are never held personally accountable.
The Thomas Friedman example is particularly sharp. Thomas Friedman aggressively advocated for the Iraq War. It was a disaster. Thousands and thousands died. Trillions of dollars were wasted. But he didn't lose his prestigious column at the New York Times. He arguably gained even more status.
The source compares this dynamic to a bus driver. Imagine you have a bus driver who puts on a blindfold, drives a bus full of people off a cliff, and kills half the passengers. He somehow survives. Does the bus company give him a new bus the very next day?
Obviously not. He's in jail.
Right. But in the intellectual class, if you drive the economy off a cliff, or you drive foreign policy off a cliff, you get tenure at a university. You get a bigger bus. This total lack of evolutionary pressure means that bad ideas just survive indefinitely. In a skin-in-the-game environment, bad ideas literally kill their carriers. In our environment, bad ideas propagate everywhere because the carriers are completely insulated from the damage.
So we have a system full of post-dictors pretending to be predictors.
A post-dictor is someone who expertly explains why the event happened only after it occurred. Oh, obviously the market crashed because of X, Y, and Z. It's just storytelling. It creates a comforting illusion of understanding. But ask that exact same person to predict the next crash, and they can't do it.
The source offers a very practical heuristic here, drawing from the psychologist Gerd Drenzer on how to actually deal with experts, specifically doctors. And I think this is super actionable for anyone listening.
This is genuinely a life-saving tip. Never ask a doctor, what should I do?
Which is pretty much the only question I've ever asked a doctor in my life.
All right, we all do it. But it invites the doctor to give you the standard textbook answer, or the answer that simply minimizes his malpractice liability. Instead, ask him, if you were in my position, what would you do?
It essentially forces him to simulate skin in the game.
Exactly. You'd be amazed how often the answer suddenly changes. They might say, well, the hospital guidelines say we should do surgery, but if it were me, I'd honestly just wait and see. You want to access his actual survival instinct, not just his rote bureaucratic knowledge.
I want to move to the solutions, or rather the ancient wisdoms the source points to, because long before we had complex compliance departments and risk officers, we had much simpler, more brutal ways of managing risk. Let's talk about Hammurabi.
A code of Hammurabi. It's almost 4,000 years old. Everyone knows the phrase eye for an eye. But we usually just dismiss it as primitive ancient vengeance. The source argues it's actually incredibly sophisticated risk management.
How so? Walk us through the builder example.
Take the building code in Hammurabi's laws. It says, if a builder builds a house and the house collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, the builder shall be put to death.
It sounds incredibly barbaric to modern ears.
It is harsh. But look at the information asymmetry. The builder knows all the hidden foundations. He knows if he used a cheap mixture for the bricks to save money. The buyer cannot possibly see that.
No.
No government inspector can perfectly see that. The only way to ensure the builder hides zero risks is to completely align his physical survival with the homeowner's survival.
It collapses the gap between the agent and the principal.
Totally. The Romans did something very similar with their bridges. The engineer who designed the bridge had to physically stand underneath the arch while the scaffolding was being removed and the very first heavy chariots crossed over it.
That is such a fantastic image. You are literally standing in the shadow of your own competence.
Or your incompetence. If you calculated the load-bearing weight wrong, you are the very first casualty. It focuses the mind in a way that a peer-reviewed academic paper never ever could.
There's another Roman concept mentioned that's even more brutal: decimation. This addresses a different problem entirely, not competence, but cowardice in groups.
This gets into the game theory of cowardice. Imagine we are both in a Roman legion. We are facing a massive barbarian horde. If we stand together shoulder to shoulder, we win. But if the line breaks, we all get slaughtered. Now, from my individual selfish perspective, what is the best possible move?
Run away.
Right. I don't have to outrun the barbarians. I just have to outrun you. If I run first, I live and you die. But if everyone thinks that way, the line disintegrates instantly. It's a massive coordination failure.
So how does decimation actually fix that dynamic?
The Romans brilliantly and ruthlessly changed the payoff matrix. If a unit showed cowardice in battle, they would be isolated afterwards. The commanders would draw lots. 1 out of every 10 men in that unit, randomly selected, would be beaten to death by their own comrades.
Randomly. So wait, even if I fought bravely, if my unit broke and ran, I could still die.
Yes. And this terrifies the soldier far more than the enemy does. It means the risk of running away is suddenly much higher than the risk of staying and fighting. It forces the entire unit to self-police. You wouldn't let the guy next to you run because his cowardice puts your life directly at risk in the lottery later. It creates a collective skin in the game.
The source also mentions the British execution of Admiral John Byng.
Yeah, Byng was executed by the British Navy for failing to do his utmost in battle. It's the exact same principle. It sends a shockwave through the entire command structure. You cannot retreat to save yourself if the penalty for retreating is guaranteed execution by your own side.
It's so interesting that we view these historical practices as savage, yet those societies survived for centuries. We view our modern system as highly civilized, yet we feel like we are constantly teetering on the verge of systemic collapse.
Because we have actively removed the very feedback loops that keep systems grounded in reality. We arrogantly think we can regulate human behavior with thousands of pages of words and compliance rules rather than raw consequences.
And then there's the concept of burning the vessels. Tariq ibn Ziyad is brought up here.
Yes, in 711 AD, Tariq lands in Spain with his army.
Oh.
What does he do? He immediately burns all of his own ships.
And he gives that famous speech.
Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. It is the ultimate removal of a fallback option. When you remove the option of retreat, you create extreme anti-fragility and motivation. You either conquer or you die. There is no middle ground, no returning to the comfort of the status quo.
This perfectly brings us to the distinction between talkers and doers. The source frames this as a fundamental battle between Aristotle and Thales.
This is a deep philosophical divide that shapes how you view the world. Aristotle represents the academic approach, logic, strict definitions, precise categories. In the Aristotelian world, you win by having the better argument. You win by being quote-unquote right in a debate.
Which is basically the entire internet today. Everyone just trying to win the argument.
Totally. It's Twitter in a nutshell. But Thales was a philosopher. But crucially, he was also a trader. He represents the doer. In the Thalian world, you don't actually care about the argument. You care about the real-world outcome. Survival. Profit.
The source introduces this great character of Fat Tony here. He's sort of the anti-intellectual intellectual.
Fat Tony is the guy from Brooklyn who doesn't know how to conjugate a verb properly, but he knows exactly when a major bank is deeply insolvent. His guiding motto is, suckers try to win arguments, non-suckers try to win.
This leads to a very technical but absolutely crucial point about payoff asymmetry. I think this is where a lot of really smart people get tripped up. They obsess over frequency, meaning how often they are factually right.
Right. A typical pundit or academic desperately wants to be right 95% of the time. They want to say, I predicted the stock market correctly 9 out of 10 days. But in the real world, the Thalian world, frequency matters way less than magnitude.
Explain that difference for us.
Okay, let's say I'm a venture capitalist or a black swan trader like the author of the source material. I can be totally wrong 99 times in a row. I lose a little bit of money each time. My frequency of being right is a pathetic 1%. I look like a complete idiot to the Aristotelians. But on the 100th time, I hit a massive jackpot that pays out 10,000 to 1.
So you easily make back all your tiny losses and walk away with a massive fortune.
Exactly. The doer only cares about the accumulated payoff, the bank account at the end of the year. The talker only cares about their batting average. The source strongly argues that systems designed by talkers, like our current financial models, they optimize for being right most of the time, which means low daily volatility. But they blow up spectacularly when they are wrong once. Systems designed by doers can handle being wrong constantly because they are structurally positioned to survive the small hits and capitalize heavily on the rare, massive events.
So how do we, as listeners trying to navigate the world, distinguish the talkers from the doers? How do we know who is actually safe to trust?
The portfolio rule. It's the ultimate filter for advice.
Don't tell me what you think. Show me your portfolio.
Never, ever listen to an opinion, a forecast, or a recommendation from someone who doesn't have a personal portfolio lining up with it. If a slick financial advisor tells you to buy tech stocks, stop him and ask, how many of those specific tech stocks do you own with your own money? If a politician says the new public healthcare system is great, ask them, do your kids use the public system, or do you send them to a private clinic?
Watch their feet, not their lips.
Precisely. And the source has a scathing critique of what he calls champagne socialists or the caviar left.
These are the people who passionately preach equality from the comfort of a gated community.
It's the dissonance that matters. He contrasts François Mitterrand, the French socialist president who ironically loved the finest aristocratic luxuries, with General de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a staunch conservative, a traditionalist, but he lived with extreme, almost violent austerity. His wife literally sewed his socks to save money. The source argues de Gaulle had immense moral authority because his private life perfectly matched his public message. Mitterrand was just a talker.
And he contrasts this on the left with Ralph Nader.
Yeah, the source calls Nader a secular saint. You might completely hate Nader's politics. He's a hardcore anti-corporate crusader, but he lives exactly as he preaches. He lives in a tiny apartment, spends almost nothing on himself, and fights the battles he genuinely believes in. That is soul in the game. You have to respect the ethical consistency, even if you fiercely disagree with the underlying ideology.
Let's talk about the entities that have absolutely no soul whatsoever, corporations. This is Section 6 of the outline. The source is pretty brutal about the fundamental nature of the corporate structure.
The argument is that a corporation, by its very legal definition, cannot have ethics. It's a legal construct specifically designed to limit personal liability. It has a balance sheet. It does not have a conscience. Therefore, its only structural goal is to maximize profit within the absolute limits of the law. And very often, it aggressively pushes past those constraints.
The source points to marketing as a signal here. This is a really counterintuitive point. Usually we think a lot of marketing means a product is highly popular or good.
The source argues the exact opposite. Heavy marketing is often necessary only when the product doesn't naturally speak for itself. You don't see massive ad campaigns for salt. You don't see Super Bowl commercials for raw vegetables. You see marketing for sugary sodas and heavily processed junk food.
So a high marketing spend is actually a red flag that the product might be inferior or even harmful.
It's a loud signal that the vendor is actively trying to hack your perception. The source calls this the cheapest to deliver problem. The corporate incentive is to produce what he calls rubber cheese, something that technically meets the bare minimum legal definition of cheese, but is the absolute cheapest possible goop they could legally sell you.
Contrast that with the artisan, the individual creator.
The artisan operates with soul in the game. The classic historical example is Steve Jobs. There's a famous story about him rejecting a design for the early Apple II circuit board because the lines weren't perfectly straight and beautiful. The engineers pushed back and said, "Steve, nobody's ever going to see this. It's locked inside the plastic case."
And Jobs said,
He said, "I will see it." That is the true artisan spirit. The aesthetic quality matters immensely, even when no one else is watching. A giant corporation will never do that. A corporation will gleefully cut every single corner that is invisible to the consumer just to save a fraction of a penny.
There's a great anecdote in the text about a debate between Niall Ferguson, the historian, and the CEO of Pepsi.
Oh yeah, this encapsulates the conflict perfectly. The Pepsi CEO arrived at this debate with a huge phalanx of aides, PR people, binders, full of cherry-picked data. She was there strictly to defend the corporate entity. Ferguson was there totally alone. And he essentially dismantled her entire argument just by pointing out the massive transfer of fragility.
How so? What was his angle?
He argued that giant companies like Pepsi completely privatized the massive profits of selling sugar water, but they socialized the devastating costs of the resulting health crisis. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, these are massive societal costs borne by the public healthcare system, which means they are paid for by the taxpayers. Pepsi takes the cash, but Pepsi doesn't pay for the public's insulin.
It's the Robert Rubin trade all over again, but with calories and disease instead of dollars.
Exactly. The corporation gets all the upside in sales revenue, society gets all the downside in chronic disease, and the source breaks down marketing into 3 specific layers of violations to show how this corporate manipulation actually works.
Let's run through those quickly. What is level 1?
Level 1 is just basic self-promotion. We are the best, buy our stuff. It's annoying, but we all easily filter it out. It's low harm.
And level 2?
Level 2 is hiding defects. This is where it gets actively unethical. It's not mentioning that the car engine has a tendency to explode under pressure, or hiding the fact that the adjustable loan rate resets to 20% next year. This is essentially lying by omission.
And on level 3, this is the dark arts of marketing.
Misrepresentation via cognitive bias. This is showing a rugged, healthy cowboy riding a beautiful horse into a vibrant sunset to sell Marlboro cigarettes.
Associating deep feelings of freedom and vitality with a product that literally gives you lung cancer.
It's hacking the deep structures of the brain. You aren't logically selling the product anymore. You're selling an emotional association that is factually false. The source argues that because corporations fundamentally lack soul in the game, they inevitably, over time, drift toward level 3 marketing. They simply have no internal shame mechanism to stop them from doing it.
We've talked a lot about the villains today, the bankers, the talkers, the giant corporations. I really want to end on the heroes, the people with soul in the game, because this goes beyond just taking your own risk. This is about real sacrifice.
It is. Skin in the game is simply, I pay for my own lunch. Soul in the game is, I pay for your lunch, and I might literally die defending your right to eat it.
The story of Al-Mutanabi in the source material really stuck with me.
It's a profound historical story about the ultimate price of words. Al-Mutanabi was widely considered the greatest poet of the Arabic language. He was very well known for his extreme grandiosity. He wrote these soaring verses boasting of his unmatched courage, lines like, "The horse, the knight, and the desert know me, and the sword, the spear, the paper, and the pen."
He was basically claiming to be the ultimate badass warrior poet.
Yes, but one day he was traveling through the desert and was suddenly ambushed by a rival tribe that he had previously insulted in his poetry. He was badly outnumbered. His immediate instinct, his natural survival instinct, was to flee. He turned his horse around to ride away.
Which is the totally rational thing to do.
Totally rational.
Yeah.
But his servant, who was riding with him, stopped him. He loudly recited Al-Mutanabi's own verses right back to him. He said, "Are you not the one who wrote, 'The horse, the knight, and the desert know me'?"
Wow. He held a mirror up to his own ego.
And Al-Mutanabi stopped. He realized in that split second that if he ran away, his poetry, his entire life's work and identity would become a permanent lie. He would be exposed as a half-person. To save the integrity of his words, he had to lose his life. So he turned around, fought the tribe, and was killed.
That is extreme, but it perfectly illustrates the point. You are only as good as your willingness to actually bleed for your stated identity.
The source also shares a very personal story about his own father that hits similar notes. During the brutal Lebanese Civil War, his father was driving and was stopped at a local militia checkpoint. The militiamen were being incredibly disrespectful and arrogant. The father could have easily just kept his head down, agreed with them, and driven safely through.
The classic gray man strategy, just survive the encounter.
Right. But he absolutely refused to be insulted by them. He demanded respect. He possessed dignity. And as he eventually drove away, the militiamen shot him right in the back.
Did he die from that?
No, he survived. But the bullet permanently lodged in his chest. He carried that bullet inside him for the rest of his life. The source says his father actually had to carry an official X-ray card just to get through airport security metal detectors. But that literal bullet was a physical, undeniable manifestation of his dignity. The lesson drawn here is dignity isn't free. If you aren't willing to take a bullet, either metaphorically in your career or literally in this case, you don't actually have dignity. You just have polite compliance.
It's a call to live life with a much higher stakes setting.
It is. It's a total rejection of the safe, sanitized, heavily bureaucratized modern life.
To wrap this deep dive up, the source leaves us with a very provocative final comparison. As a society, we tend to instinctively trust civil servants, and we deeply distrust mobsters. But the source argues we might have that entirely backwards.
It's the story of Lawrence of Arabia versus Meyer Lansky. Lawrence was a highly educated British civil servant, essentially a spy. He went deep into the desert to the Arab tribes and solemnly promised them, "If you fight with us against the Ottomans, Britain will guarantee you an independent Arab state." He genuinely believed it. He had personal integrity. Right. But he was merely an agent of a massive bureaucracy. The British government, specifically via the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, completely betrayed that promise. They just carved up the Middle East for themselves and the French. Lawrence was personally crushed. He was turned into a liar, not because he wanted to be, but because he was a half-person serving a sprawling system with absolutely no honor.
Contrast that tragic figure with Meyer Lansky.
The infamous mobster. The source says a simple handshake from Meyer Lansky was worth significantly more than a 1,000-page legal contract drafted by a top Wall Street law firm.
Why is that? Why trust a criminal over a lawyer?
Because Lansky had total skin in the game. If he broke his word on a deal, he lost his street reputation, his illicit business empire, and very likely his life. There was no transfer of fragility available to him. He couldn't hide behind a PR department or claim a change in political administration. His word was inexorably bound to his physical survival.
It's a really challenging thought. We obviously aren't telling anyone to go out and be a mobster, but we are asking, do you operate with the ironclad reliability of a mobster, or do you have the slippery, unaccountable nature of a modern bureaucrat?
That's the ultimate question.
So, listener, here's the challenge for you this week. Look closely at your own life. Look at your job, your investments, your advice. Which column are you actually in? Are you in column 1, quietly transferring your risk to others? Are you in column 2, honestly owning your own risk? Or are you aspiring to column 3, taking on risk for something much bigger than yourself?
And honestly, just as importantly, look at who you are listening to. When you turn on the news tonight, when you read a fiery op-ed, look closely for the scars. If they don't have visible scars, they don't have a real portfolio, just turn them off.
Don't tell me what you think. Show me your portfolio. Leave it
Yeah.
right there. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.